Well, hello and welcome to Ask an Apologist. My name is Matthew Middleberg, and I'm joined here today by Mike Sherrard, Alicia Wood, and our special guest, Abdu Murray, to answer your spiritual questions. And this is something that we do once a month at Apologetics Inc. on our social channels on Facebook and YouTube and X. And so if you want to join once a month and ask your questions, we would love to have you. And today, you can ask your questions to our special guest, Abdu Murray. And Abdu has a long and illustrious career as a lawyer as well as an apologist. And so we're going to be asking him some questions about his experience with all of those things. And yeah, Abdu, we're just grateful to have you on the stream today.
It's always a pleasure to be hanging out with you guys. And yeah, thanks for having me on, guys. It's just really something I'm looking forward to.
Awesome. So just to kick off the stream and ask a few questions about your background and your transition kind of into apologetics from the world of law. Why, in the first place, would you leave the thrilling world of crime and punishment and law and come to the boring world of ministry? Why would you do that?
Well, I'd say that in the past, I've been doing ministry for it's going on 21 years now. We founded
Wow.
Embrace the Truth actually in 2004. And it was a part-time deal. It was meant to be, who knows what'll happen, we'll see. Maybe it'll become a full-time ministry. Maybe it won't. Maybe I'll just stay as a lawyer and do ministry activities on the side. And for a long time, it was that, because for a long time, the only donor to our ministry was me. And then that changed. We got more and more invitations, and being a lawyer was full-time, and quickly being a Christian evangelist and apologist started to become full-time. And because I like my family a lot, I wanted to be with them. So I couldn't do two careers at the same time, given the demands that were being put on. So we got our act together and raised enough donor support and all the kind of supports we needed to be able to go full time into ministry, and we did that. As I'll tell you, being a lawyer was a fun job. Like every job, it's got its moments where you're like, "Why?"
What kind of law were you practicing?
I did complex commercial litigation. So I worked at two very large firms. I was partner at both firms, and I did civil litigation. Typically, a company A sues company B over some complex commercial transaction. I did some fraud stuff, some security stuff, class action defense. I got into even like estate litigation. I wasn't a transactional lawyer. I liked to, object and be sustained and pound on tables and froth at the mouth and talk to juries. I like that. I'm a competitive guy. I just couldn't imagine just doing transactional work. I had to know if there was a winner, if there was a loser. I was a natural born advocate. And so when I became a believer, right around the time I actually became a full-time lawyer, it was hand in glove. I was a natural born advocate. If I believed in something, I wanted to be an advocate for it. But I also liked seeing all sides of an argument. And I'm a big believer. I'm a big believer in steel manning an argument that doesn't agree with me. I want to know the best version of that argument and respond to the best version of that argument. Because I can learn something, but two, my arguments become better. And that was one of the best things I learned about being a lawyer, was how to see both sides, or in some complex cases, all sides, and then be able to respond to the best version of those arguments, see the flaws in your own, and the strengths in your own. So apologetics played a huge role in my coming to faith. And because of that, me being a natural advocate, me loving apologetics in terms of its power, not only to speak to the mind, but also speak to the heart. Going into full-time ministry was a natural thing for me at some point. I'm a natural born advocate. So I found myself waking up thinking about ways to do ministry, going to bed thinking about ways I wasn't able to do ministry that day. And so that basically became the call for me to know that this is where I was supposed to be and what I was supposed to do. Now, I think that there's plenty of great apologists and ministry people who are doing some tremendous work completely bivocationally, and they're doing a great job. In fact, I think that's quite biblical and might even be more of a biblical model than what I'm doing. But I find myself...
That's a great... you learned that in fundraising school, right? It's
yeah.
There's probably people doing this more biblically than me, but
Yeah.
Give today.
Yeah. Yeah, that's my terrible pitch for anybody who's listening.
I
By the
was
way, you
having
can donate.
I was having breakfast. This is one of the reasons I like you, man. You're just real, right? But I was having breakfast with a guy the other day, and I was talking about some of the pitfalls of platform kind of ministry. And the way
Mhm.
I was describing it was like I was delegitimizing our entire speaking team. And I was like, this is a good fundraising pitch, isn't it? He thought that was hilarious. But
Yeah.
there's obvious value in what we do, but
Mhm.
there are pitfalls to avoid,
Oh, yeah.
and we're not the only answer to the problem that exists. So again,
Oh,
that's
yeah.
not fundraising. They don't teach you that in
Yeah.
fundraising school. But anyway, sorry, go
Right.
ahead, man.
But we are an important part of it. And we do serve a function, and
Mhm.
thank God I get to do it. It really is, and Matthew and Alicia know this from our previous days as colleagues. Um, we would always pray at the end of our team meetings, Lord, help us to remember this is a privilege. It's not a right.
Mm.
We're not entitled to do this, but we get to do this. So help us to recognize that. And I think that helps you avoid some of those pitfalls. But yeah, that's how I got into it. Uh, the demands became enough to where I could go full time, and that's what I did.
Wow. That's great. You said complex commercial litigation. I thought that's where, a Super Bowl ad is like way too long and you go after them because of it. But
Yeah.
we do need more of that as well. But
Yeah.
your explanation makes sense. So
Yeah. It's funny.
well,
I wrote my first book
yeah.
while in the middle of one of the busiest seasons as a lawyer I had. I was defending a very large class action lawsuit, which required just tons of driving and travel and everything and depositions galore. And I look back at that book and I see it on my shelf and I'm like, how in the world did I pull that off? Given all that I was doing um, at the same time. So the complex part was definitely true.
Yeah.
But it prepared me. It prepared me to be, I think, hopefully a good advocate for the gospel's sake.
That's great. Very cool.
Yeah.
Before we jump into the next question, I just want to remind everybody that if you have a question for Abdu or for any of us about apologetics, about faith, about God, you can put those in the comments and they will come to us and we'll do our best to address those questions. So we want to engage with you and have this discussion, as well as if you know anyone who might be interested in this conversation right now that you want to share this conversation with, please go ahead and do that. I got a text from Swanee, the chaplain at MIT for Campus Crusade for Christ, and he said he was sharing it with his students. So,
Awesome.
yeah, a lot of us know Swanee. So, anyone who wants to share this on your social media or with friends that you think might be interested or might benefit from this conversation, we would love to help as many people as we can to answer their spiritual questions. So, let me ask just this, Abdu, as you kind of were doing both of these and you were seeing how ministry was different from law, where did your legal expertise come into play the most with apologetics?
I would say so the legal expertise happened sort of after my conversion. I was in law school in the middle of it. And I would say that the ability to see all sides of an argument and the way in which you can, at good law schools, you're not taught law. You're taught how to think like a lawyer. You get taught law later. And you get taught law along the way. I mean, don't get me wrong, you do. But for the most part, when you're engaged in law school, they know that your bar review course will teach you the law and that your legal practice will. You're supposed to be thinking like a lawyer. And so I think I would say given the thing I was struggling with, I was coming from a different worldview. I came from a completely different worldview, which was claimed to be an evidentially based worldview. Came from the worldview of Islam, and it claims to be evidentially based that there's reasons why Muslims believe the Quran is the unchanged word of God. And they give their various arguments. So along the way, when I was searching, and I started law school probably in year 6, 7, and 8 of my search into becoming a Christian, which took about 9 years. Really, what honed me was the ability to say, okay, I've seen the assumptions being made in every argument. I don't care how good your argument actually is when there's evidence. There are some assumptions you're making in those arguments. And a good lawyer knows how to look at the assumptions, test if those assumptions are actually good or not, and then poke and prod at them and see where there's some holes or where some evidence is lacking. But overall, what I think also helped me was an understanding of burden of proof.
Mm.
Because once I
Mm.
was able to test those assumptions, then I began to understand what burden of proof is really all about. Because people often think of the ideas of coming to a faith conclusion one way or the other based on proof. Like, oh, I can prove to you this, or I have all the proof I need of my worldview. That's not how claims work.
Mm.
Burdens of proof, there are three levels. There are a few more, but there are basically three levels within the law of burdens of proof. There's preponderance of the evidence, there's the great weight of the evidence, and then there is beyond reasonable doubt. There's never such a thing as beyond all doubt.
Mhm.
Or beyond any doubt or a shadow of a doubt. There's just no such
Mm.
thing in the law. And those burdens of proof get higher and higher depending on the stakes at issue. So if you're in a civil case, and I was, like I said, a
Mhm.
commercial civil lawyer, most cases were preponderance of the
Piece of
evidence, which meant
evidence.
that
Yep.
because it's simply it's money
Mhm.
most of the time. Uh, all you have to do is prove be above 50%. It can be 50.1 or it could be 51, depending on how you look at it. Is it more likely than not that side A has proven their case? And if the answer is yes, then you find for that party. So it's just a 51%, roughly speaking, calculus. The great weight of the evidence is a little higher. Typically, you have that in civil fraud cases and other kinds of cases as well. You have to go to the great weight of the evidence, and that essentially means is it more than a preponderance? Is this something of a higher probability? Have they met a substantial burden in proving their claim? And then there's the reasonable doubt. Now, notice something in the fraud case. What you have, reason why the standard is higher is because you have like treble damages. You have much higher damages at stake in
Mm.
sort of commercial fraud cases and various other kinds of fraud. So the plaintiff has to meet a higher burden because the cost of the defendant is so much higher. So we want to
Mm.
make sure the plaintiff is right. Typically, that's why we do it. Now, in the criminal case, the cost is freedom or even your life and death penalty
Mhm.
cases. So we automatically raise the burden of proof to beyond reasonable doubt in order to, because the stakes are high. What that showed me, by the way, and this is something I've talked about in other instances, is that when we're talking to somebody who is a non-Christian, for example, and they're making a claim, now the person who makes the claim bears the burden of proof. Oftentimes, they want to impose upon the Christian a burden of proof that is higher than the preponderance of the evidence. But
Mm.
that actually that doesn't make any sense in the case that if I'm wrong as a Christian, the stakes are not that high because if there is no God, you just won't know it. It's sort of a version of Blaise Pascal's wager is that if I'm wrong, the penalty for me being wrong is oblivion, and you too. So I don't have to meet a higher burden than preponderance of the evidence. However, if as an atheist you're wrong, the stakes are infinitely high. And so you actually have a higher burden than I do, given the stakes for your claim. So if anybody had, now I would happily defer to an atheist and say, look, your burden of proof can be preponderance. I'm okay with that. It doesn't bother me. But if we're going to stick someone with a higher burden of proof, it's got to be the person whose stakes are higher if they're wrong.
Mm.
And
Wow.
That's
that seems to
interesting.
me-
I've literally never heard anybody put it like that, Abdu. And I'm curious. So
Yeah.
I guess this is how you would engage like the atheist that says extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that
Mhm.
they often put that forward to say, you know,
Mhm.
it's in the same kind of thing. You want me to believe what you had for lunch yesterday? I don't need a whole lot of evidence, but you want me to
Right.
believe that God came down as a man and came back from the grave. I need evidence that's extraordinary. So
Mhm.
is this what you just explained similar to how you or it's how you would
Yeah.
answer that objection?
Yeah, I think it's somewhat similar. I think that how I look at it, Tim Barnett, our friend Tim Barnett, often he said one time, he says, "Extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence." Really, do hilarious claims need hilarious evidence?
Mm.
You know, and it's
I
a very
think they
thin
do,
line.
by the way. So
Yeah, they probably do actually. Yeah, but I get what they're saying. And so what they're trying to say is if you make a crazy claim, or at least a claim that's way outside the norm, you have the burden of giving a lot of evidence. So when someone says extraordinary, what do they mean? Do they mean quality or do they mean quantity or some measure of both? Like the evidence has to be so crazy clear for me to believe what you just said that it has to be irrefutable. I don't think that's fair because there's nothing we believe with that kind of evidence.
Mm.
However, with for the for an atheist, because of the stakes in of what's happening here, I think it's justifiable to say you have to come up with some pretty great evidence to convince me that the universe sprang from nothing without a cause at all, given the consequences of
Mm.
the error of your claim, because it's
Right.
already an extraordinary claim, and you have to provide me with some pretty, I think, solid evidence for me to overcome the assumption. I don't mean crazy amounts of evidence, just good evidence, a lot of good evidence for me to overcome the assumption that things don't happen without causes. Um, and given the consequences, now you really have to give me some good evidence here.
Yeah.
Not
Wow, that's good.
extraordinary evidence in terms of irrefutable. I just mean you have to meet a very high burden. So I don't think extraordinary, like if I made the claim that someone committed a crime, it's fairly extraordinary in that sense. So we elevate the burden of proof because of the consequence.
Right.
But in a civil case, if I say that the same person did the same act, but now instead of prosecuting them for murder, I'm suing them, not prosecuting, but I'm suing them for wrongful death. My burden is lower. So O.J. Simpson is prosecuted for murder. He's got the prosecution has to meet the reasonable doubt standard, but the Goldman family sued O.J. for wrongful death,
Right.
and they won because their burden was lower because the
Wow.
consequences were lower.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So you look at the burden of evidence as regards to impact, right? So as opposed to like the blanket statement that everybody needs to provide evidence. This is such a cool way of thinking about it. You say, okay, yeah, maybe part B might actually be putting that everybody needs to provide evidence aside. Actually, if the impact is greater, then whoever has the greater impact needs to be the one to provide more evidence, which is interesting because I've asked atheists over and over again, give me evidence for atheism. And all I've ever gotten is, well, I think your Bible's corrupted and I don't accept your Jesus and, things like that. So their evidence for atheism is I'm refuting your Christianity. And it's like, okay, look, Christianity can be proven false tomorrow, but that doesn't make your atheism true. So what is your evidence for atheism? And they've never given me evidence for their position because they're always trying to absolve themselves of it. But this way of talking about it, I think just reinforces them actually because of the weight of your decisions. Don't let yourself slide out from underneath this.
Yeah.
Like you actually have a larger burden of proof.
Right. And they'll try to say, I don't have a worldview. I have basically a worldview that
Lack of belief.
Lack of belief. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's just,
Anthony. Yeah.
there's a number of things wrong with
Anthony
that. But because you clearly do have beliefs, and you have beliefs in negative things, but you also have beliefs about the way the world came to exist. And until you can justify that, you have a burden. All of us have burdens of proof. Plus, here's an interesting thing that people don't recognize with burdens of proof is burdens of proof in the law shift. So there's a thing called a rebuttable presumption in the law, and certain kinds of claims, there are certain things that are presumed to be true based on the kind of claim it is, and then the other side can rebut it. And so oftentimes the defense doesn't have a burden of proof. And an atheist might say, that's me. I'm in the defense part. The prosecution or the plaintiff has the burden of proof. I don't have the burden of proof because I'm a defendant. But first, two things on that. One is that when juries are looking at a case, unless it's crystal clear the prosecution or the plaintiff hasn't met their burden, they still want to know what happened. Juries are never, or rarely, I should say, ever satisfied with, oh, I guess we'll never know. But I can't find them.
Yeah.
So the defense typically has to provide a possible or a plausible explanation. Now, the defense doesn't have technically a burden to do that, but there's not a lot of juries that are okay with you just saying, try again, try again. That just doesn't work in juries. That's one thing. Second thing is that oftentimes burdens can shift. You have cases where once a plaintiff, like contributory or comparative negligence standards, if a plaintiff proves negligence, now the defense can actually create a comparative negligence standard, which means that the plaintiff's damages go down by how much the plaintiff actually contributed to the problem. So let's say I run out in the street and get hit by a car. Okay, and someone wasn't looking, they were on their phone and they hit me. Well, are my damages lowered by the fact that I just ran out on the street,
Right.
completely crazily?
Right.
Now the defense has to prove that, so the burden shifts. Very rarely in real life do we actually ever have one-sided burdens. People
Yeah.
typically have burdens all the time, and the law helped me to see that as I was exploring things of faith.
Well, I think I've often given the analogy of, all of us are in a plane going down together, and there's a wall of parachutes, and the parachutes say Christianity and Buddhism and Islam and, all of these different worldviews. And, you can choose to put one of them on and put your faith and your trust in that idea, and you might have arguments or reasons or evidences for it. Or you could just choose to go in the plane that's going down and refuse to make a decision. But in that case, like, you're making that choice. Like, you're making the choice not to commit. And by what means, by what evidence have you provided that it's okay for you not to choose?
Mhm.
It's your entire life, your eternity potentially is being put in the hands of uncertainty. And I don't think that's something that ought to be done lightly.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
think go ahead.
I was going to say, to quote the Celestial Poets, the rock band Rush, in their song "Free Will," they say, "You can choose a ready guide in some celestial voice, but if you choose not to decide, you still have made the choice."
Yep.
I think
Oof.
that's right.
Good line.
Beautiful,
Yeah.
beautiful. I
Wish I
love
had
that.
written it.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a great
No
line for the
kidding.
agnostic.
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
they're the one person that's kind of like, all right, I haven't landed anywhere, even though they still have a belief because something's impacting their morality and how they see the world and blah blah blah. But they're the only ones that can be like, look, I don't provide evidence, kind of a decision. But that's an interesting, to emphasize actually. But we, even in the lack of saying, I'm just going to live in I don't know land,
Mhm.
you've made a decision to not go that extra step to find out
Yeah,
what is
yes,
true.
indeed.
I think it's
Did
also
you all
worth
see?
pointing out, Abdu. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say recently, Joe Rogan's been an interesting guy here recently. Did you see the clip where he was kind of mocking the atheist hubris or the condescension regarding miraculous claims and evidence? There, did you see this? Where he said, like, he quotes, I forget who he quotes, but he says, you know what the difference is between science and religion? Religion asks you to believe in a lot of miracles. Science only asks you to believe
Oh,
in
yeah.
one. And then Rogan goes on to mock this position. Like, he says, there's the what did he say? He's like, the astonishment of trying to believe in something like the resurrection is just ridiculous. But we at least have one miracle that you have to believe in, that sometime in the distant past, the entire universe was condensed into something smaller than the pinhead. And for no reason that's yet been explained, it came into existence uncaused out of nothing. So you believe at least in that miracle. And Rogan literally says, now he's probably joking, he says, I'm going to stick with Jesus.
Oh, yeah, I've
Which
seen
was
that.
Yeah, Jesus makes more sense, is what he
Such
said.
an interesting.
It was fascinating.
Yeah.
Such a different
Well, and I think
conversation
that's
about what's
such
going
an
on with Rogan, but-
understatement too, because it's not just the virgin birth of the universe; it's the virgin birth of life and of consciousness and of intelligence and rationality and free will, and all of these different things, complexity from non-complexity, design from non-design. That I think the atheist claim is much more incredible, especially given all of the evidence for theism. And I think what I was going to say too, Abdu, is you're not saying, oh, we need to increase the burden of the atheists and decrease our burden because we don't really have that much evidence for Christianity. Actually, no, actually, like, we have an avalanche of evidence, as Tom Woodward would say.
Yeah.
We've got
Tsunami.
just so much
That's what
evidence.
Tom would say.
Tsunami, an avalanche of tsunamis of evidence for
How many can we pile
Christianity.
on?
So
Wildfires of it.
absolutely. Yeah.
Let's have
Yeah.
more natural disasters. No,
Yeah.
you're 100% right. I
Yeah.
don't think that's what I'm saying at all. In fact, I would say that
Yeah.
even if the burden of proof was elevated to reasonable doubt, we could meet it. Absolutely.
Mhm.
What I'm trying to say is that let's not engage in this fiction that only the believer in God of some kind, and specifically the Christian, has a burden of proof. That is just
Yeah.
a fiction, and it's a
Yeah.
convenient rhetorical trick, but it's not really. It's not valid in any way, shape, or form. So let's get away from that fiction. And now, when we do that, we can engage in a real robust conversation where we're not just, sort of playing tennis with the wall. Hit the ball at it, it bounces back. Try again. You're having a real conversation when you're doing that. 100%.
And I think too,
That's really
there's
good.
times in life in which the person who's making the claim, so we would think the person making the claim would be the Christian, but there's times in life when the person making the claim is actually not the one where the burden of proof falls. It falls on the person they're accusing. So a simple example is if you get pulled over by a police officer, he's making the claim that you were speeding and he gives you a ticket. It's your job to prove your innocence.
Mm-hmm.
And it's same thing with like the IRS. Like if they say you've been cheating on your taxes, right? They'll send you a letter, you've been cheating. It's your job to prove your innocence. So there are times in which the other side actually the burden of proof falls on them, even though they're not even making the claim, that the burden of proof falls on them. And so actually I think and you want to obviously when the scales are, if it's a speeding ticket, let's just say it's $50. Some people may say, I don't even care about making a case. I'd rather just pay the 50 and go about my way. But if it's the IRS and they're saying you owe us $45,000 in back taxes, the cost of that is going to make you say, well, maybe I would defend myself because the consequence to me is so great. So yeah, so then we're getting back to that whole, the consequence and the weight is so big that I should provide evidence. But I do also think that there's certain times in life in which it's not just the person making the claim, so the Christian, that there is a God, but it's the person who's receiving the information where they actually provide the evidence, like when the police officer says to you, you're speeding.
Mm-hmm.
If it's worth it to you, based on the consequence, the proof falls on you.
Can I nerd out a second ago? One more second on the law on this one, because you just
You're going to find bad company here if you're going to try to nerd out on something. We don't ever do that.
No, yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure you never do. I've had too many lunches with both these two.
Conversations.
Yeah, exactly. So technically speaking, this is interesting. Because what you're pointing out is a practical reality. Technically speaking, however, if the IRS makes a claim, the IRS does have the burden of proving it, and the cop has the burden of proving it. But practically speaking, they're presumed to be right.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a rebuttable presumption. So what ends up happening is that, let's say you get a traffic ticket, you walk into traffic court. Technically, the police have to prove that you committed a crime. That's how it works, or a misdemeanor or a violation of some kind. Now, practically speaking, the judge will give tremendous deference to the officer, and you've got to give some compelling evidence as to why the judge should believe you over the officer, even if it was just a, he said, she said. They're going to go with it, the officer 9 times out of 10, if not more. So it's practically a burden of proof that the prosecution or the state has to make. But it's technically that. It's practically, however, you've got to do something about it. You can't just sit there and say, try again, try again, try again. That's just not how that works. And I think that's the spiritual conversation. If I make a claim, and especially when there's that much evidence in favor of that claim. So, we're talking about the one miracle you have to believe as an atheist. Well, and it's funny because I don't know if Rogan pointed this out. So if he did, I didn't see the clip. I saw the end of the clip where he says, I'll stick with Jesus. I haven't clicked on the link yet. I got to watch the link. But that one line of that one miracle they have to believe is actually the start of a cascading number of infinite miracles they have to believe with the same kind of justification they have to believe the first one by. In other words, it's not cumulative. So if I were to believe that the universe sprang into existence from a state of nothing, and nothing created everything, and nothing has causative powers, even though it's not a thing, then I have to also believe that nothing and the mindlessness therefore has some kind of explicable generative power to organize matter in such a way that the universe exists, and that unguided process that came from complete nothingness also not only organized matter for the universe to exist, but that universe existed so that life could exist. And then the cascading miracle becomes now that life actually begins to evolve despite all of the odds against it evolving in the first place. Then it evolves into sentient beings who actually have rationality and non-material minds and morality. And so all of these things are cascading miracles you have to justify based on the very first one, which is this all came from nothing. And that doesn't matter, but all of the consequences from that. Contrast that to the Christian worldview, which says that an uncaused cause, which is perfectly reasonable, by the way, logically speaking, created everything. And that therefore it's unsurprising to find a universe that's life permitting, that can have sentient beings that are moral and that are conscious actually exist. So it's I say that because I remember I was researching for a debate, and my debate partner was on a radio show, and I listened to everything my debate opponents say, and I read their stuff. They were talking about this question about the one miracle. He says, "Well, as far as I see it, when you're believing in God or Christianity or atheism," and he was an atheist, he says, "we're basically dealing with competing absurdities." And I'm like,
Hmm.
"Well, are they competing really? Because
Right.
you might think that this one's absurd, but yours seems to have not just competing, but cascading absurdities." And I
Mm.
think
Mm,
that's the biggest issue. That's why the burden is so hard to meet.
yeah.
Man, you're brilliant, dude. That's great stuff right there.
Oh, go on.
Amen.
Let's end the show. Nothing else we say will be worth listening to after that. That's good stuff, man.
Well, that actually reminds me, we have a May fundraising campaign for Apologetics Inc. And we actually do.
Oh,
So if
good.
you would like to support us, the every new gift is being doubled through a generous gift matching grant up to $50,000 this month. So if you believe in what we're doing here at Apologetics Inc., if you enjoy this conversation, if you want to be a part of this ministry, go to apologetics.org/donate, and we would love to partner with you for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of helping people to understand the truth, beauty, and goodness of the gospel. So, and we'll bring on other guests like Abdu so that they can share their generous wisdom with us.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, and this summer we got a ton of work. I mean, ton of speaking engagements, mostly focusing on youth and the next generation. We're working with Scott Klusendorf and the Life Training Institute on a 4-week or 4-session pro-life curriculum designed for the church. That's pretty big and pretty cool. So we got a lot of cool projects going on right now that
That's true.
yeah,
definitely need funding.
Good.
absolutely. Yeah.
Well, if you're watching, please support them.
Thanks, Abdu.
Yeah.
All right. Let me ask this because I never did law. I'm not legally trained, but I did speech and debate.
Mhm.
And in speech and debate, I learned a ton. It applies so much to what I do today, has helped me equip me for a lot of speaking and writing and researching and all of that. But there was one thing that I had to learn very quickly was very different about speech and debate than about evangelistic conversations about apologetics. And that is there is no impartial third party that you need to convince. There's only
Mhm.
one other party usually when you're in a conversation, and that person is not unbiased. They are not impartial, and they are trying to just destroy that opponent. Does not work in a real conversation. Actually, it only offends. It doesn't help.
Mhm.
And so you need to, yes, you can disagree with somebody, and you can do that, but you need to do so in a conversational way, in a respectful way, and in a way that is more about trying to convince the person than it is about trying to destroy their arguments. So let me ask you, in your legal expertise, what's one of the biggest differences that you've seen in the practicing law versus doing apologetics?
Yeah. Well, typically when you come out of a case or a court hearing or whatever it might be, there's a winner.
Yeah,
And someone declares that person to be the winner. By the way, and that person is supposed to be impartial, but they're human. The
yeah,
judge or the jury, by the way, as well. They can be somewhat partial, and you can recognize that. So I think one of the fundamental differences is that you walk away from a hearing, and your motion is either granted or it's denied,
mm,
or the other side's motion is granted or denied, and you walk away knowing what the
Mm.
outcome was. You might not agree with the outcome, but you walk away with the outcome. That as a person who's inherently competitive, that sort of that was satisfying, and it was kind of a little frustrating sometimes that some conversations, spiritually speaking, just don't have that kind of outcome.
yeah,
At least I thought that was the case. I have grown to really understand that I think though I've made mistakes, and you guys have been on, some of you guys have been on my micro podcast that was on called Coulda, Shoulda, Woulda, where we would talk about mistakes we would make in conversations, of which I have plenty. I've kind of discovered something is that I don't think I've ever truly lost a spiritual conversation because it wasn't mine to win.
mm,
And I think that is a big part of a big difference is I have a client as a lawyer, and I advocate for that client zealously and effectively within the bounds of the law, and within the bounds of the ethics. I, of course, do that as well with my faith. But I am now, and as a lawyer, you represent your client, but there's a difference. When you're a Christian, you're an ambassador. And not only do you make the case your client would make, and your client being the so let's just be crude about it, it's the Lord, but you actually have to act like your Lord would act. As a
Mm.
lawyer, I don't have to act. If I have a genteel, mousy, sort of don't want to ruffle the feathers kind of a client, but he's completely right in his case, I'm and I'm not a I don't think I'm a bombastic, just sort of like bull in a china shop kind of a guy. But if I need to be forceful at a given moment, relative to the case as appropriate, I'll be a little more forceful. If I need to pull back, I'll pull back based on the situation at hand. Um, and my client is completely different than me. Completely different than me. Sometimes I've had to control clients who are complete bulldogs, just rush over this thing and go
Mm.
nuts and scorched earth. I'm like, that's not the way to do this. It's not the smart way to do this, nor maybe even the right way. With evangelism, I find it different. With evangelism, I'm an ambassador. 2 Corinthians 5:20. I'm an ambassador for him, which means I have to act as he would act, and be conformed to his image, so that when I provide the argument, um, I recognize that I'm not beating my opponent. And like I said, I've never lost a spiritual conversation, although I've definitely not done as well as I could have done, um, because I'm not really competing. The other
Mm.
side, so to speak, is not my opponent. We're actually on the same side, and we're on the side of, whether we know it or not. We're on the side of, um, ultimate destiny, and what is the best for each other. So
Mm.
if the other side, my opponent, loses in a litigation, and I think I was right, and my case was just and true, I don't feel sorry for them, because their case was wrong, and no hard feelings, and we can go have lunch that later afterwards, me and the opposing counsel, no big deal. The stakes are different here. The stakes are so much different, because I'm not interested in winning. It's winning people over. That's why Paul
Mm.
says we destroy our lofty arguments and everything that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, but we never destroy people. We never vanquish our opponents,
Mm.
because we don't really have opponents. Now,
Mm.
we might have debate opponents on a formal debate, but when we're trying to reach somebody, we never really have an opponent.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that is a fundamental difference between the way in which you advocate for the sake of the gospel, and you advocate as in any other area of life, for example. I think that you're trying to win the heart and mind of the person you're actually talking to, and maybe even the indirect audience. This, Matthew, from Lee Strobel's stuff about ricochet evangelism. Sometimes the gospel smacks off a hard heart and finds a soft one nearby, because someone's listening in, and I've seen that happen again and again. But it only
Yep.
smacks off the hard heart and hits the soft one nearby if you don't see the hard heart as an opponent, but as
Mm.
somebody to be reached.
Yeah. Well said. It's great.
Yeah, it's hard today. Well, it's probably always been hard, but especially hard today, where you reduce people to the beliefs they hold, and so that
Mhm.
makes it blurry, right? Because yeah, you should destroy arguments. There's ideas that should be hated because of how harmful they are, but we reduce people to the ideas they have and the beliefs they hold, and then it gets blurry, and we end up wanting to destroy the person and conquer them instead of love them. So that's really good, and especially for people that are competitive. There's something here in evangelism where most people are competitive, but there's some that are like super competitive.
Yeah.
If you played at sports and you're going to have sports all through college and high school and college, and
Mhm.
so there's holy desires for victory, and there are unholy desires for
Yeah.
victory, and all this is wrapped up in competition. And very rarely do William Rushner writes about this in a really good book, How to Win Arguments More Often Than Not. And one of the things
Mhm.
he talks about there is very rarely will you ever know you won the argument. Now, sometimes you do. Sometimes you get the person that just goes, hey, good point. I never thought about that.
Mhm.
But when it comes to these deeply held beliefs that we have, you don't like the other person that shows you you're wrong about it. And Rushner has this clever way of doing it. It's like nobody, when confronted and shown that their deeply, dearly held belief was false, slaps themselves in the knee and goes, by golly, gee, thank you for telling me. It's like it's met with resistance and pride, the prideful towers and the fortresses that have been built it's going to take time for them to fall and crumble and for one to admit defeat. And he uses another analogy here where he just talks about it's going to take some time for them to rearrange their mental furniture. And they may not even be aware that they're doing it themselves, but eventually they'll realize that they're not sitting in the same chair they used to because they now know it's much too fragile. And so this just takes time. And to your point, we play but a part in that, a meaningful part. But how we engage in this, the humility that we possess, the love, the being careful to not reduce somebody to an idea that's to be hated, but to love the person that's been infected by a harmful idea, and to humbly and boldly be used by God to play the part that we have, and also just be able to walk away with the dissatisfaction of not seeing a victory, if you will. And so that's a great lesson for all of us, especially those of us that are either professionally involved in apologetics or those that maybe are really just into it. And it's a good lesson to be reminded of. And
I got a letter 2 days ago, yesterday, actually, now that I think about it. I was traveling and was ruminating over the event I had just done. And I got a letter after having a lengthy private conversation, I won't give the details, of a person who's not a Christian who's thinking about it. And it was all about the method of the conversation and how that went. And I frankly think this person is just a gentle nudge from the kingdom. But what I was more gratified, what I thought was the victory wasn't that, she had become a believer. What I thought was the victory was that, and from my perspective, was that I acted in a way that got that person to see that this is at least worth considering. This is worth believing, and this is how Christians act, or at least should act. I can't say I've always done that, but I can say, in this particular instance, I had evidence of it. So you don't always know the winners. That's true, unless you define winners a different way. And I do think that we'll soon have another sister alongside us, not too long from now. But that was just so gratifying to me. Oh man, if I see another video that says, thus and such destroys atheist, or leftist student owned by political
Matthew, change the title of your last video pretty quickly.
Like, oh my goodness, come on, man. I mean, that's not
oh my goodness.
I'm with you. I hear you, man.
It's clickbait. Clickbait.
Abdu, I wanted to ask you a question. Let me just remind our listeners, if you have a question that you'd like to ask Abdu, you can put it in the comments and we'll do our best to answer that. But I wanted to ask you, you wrote Saving Truth, which to me was one of the most helpful books that I've read on the subject of truth and the philosophy of truth and why it's important. And I really appreciated how you pointed out the way that culture praises and values confusion. And I thought that was such just a powerful thing. So I thought maybe you could even talk about that a little bit. But also, I think you said you're writing a new book when I had interviewed you on my YouTube channel. And you said you're writing a new book on reality collapse. So I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit too.
Sure. Yeah. So the idea here with this idea of a culture that values confusion over clarity, not over certainty, because I don't think certainty is our problem. I think clarity is our problem. If you're confused about sexuality, well, then you're open-minded, and that's a virtue. If you're confused about and uncertain or unclear about who has the path to God, that's considered very, very tolerant. And if you're confused about like morality and you allow for lots of fuzziness and gray, well, then that's sort of an accepting thing and a non-judgmental. And so all these things become virtues. If you are clear on these things, if you have clear ideas about sexual mores and that they are within certain confines, well, that's considered very, very bigoted. And if you're clear about there being one way to God, well, my goodness, that's about as regressive and as intolerant as you can get. And if you're clear on sort of objective moral values and duties, though you obviously know that there are situational issues where we stumble through these things, well, that's about as regressive and restrictive as you can possibly get. So confusion becomes a virtue and clarity becomes a sin. Until, of course, your thing rises to the dominance. Your ideas of sexuality, morality, and religion rise to the fore and become dominant, and now you're very certain that anyone who disagrees with you is Hitler. And so clarity suddenly becomes a virtue, but it's an opposite whipsaw effect, that tolerance becomes intolerance and inclusivism becomes exclusivism. And that's the very essence of post-truth, which is where you elevate feelings and preferences above facts and truth. You don't deny that truth exists. You simply relegate it to the bottom shelf, or maybe you put it in the closet and leave it in there for a while until it helps you. If it hurts you, keep it back there. We don't want to talk about it. So we don't deny it. We just kind of obfuscate. That's the whole thing there. And then as far as the new book goes, by the way, shout out to David C. Cook, my publisher, because we've been wrestling with the title for a little bit. And I think we came on a winner. And so right now it's called Fake ID. And it's about essentially technology, identity ideology, and the collapse of reality. So we're looking at two cultural forces that are happening at the same time. It's kind of Saving Truth 2.0 in the sense that we're looking at, since I wrote Saving Truth in 2018, what's happened since then, and the two cultural tsunamis that have happened, to bring another natural disaster into the whole thing. The two cultural tsunamis that have happened are what I call identitarianism, this idea that there is authoritarianism to identity politics, specifically around gender, which gets us to not see reality as it actually is, and AI mania. Now, I'm not against AI, but this whole AI mania where we're just letting it do everything for us is collapsing reality, and it's collapsing reality in large ways. The biggest reality that is collapsing is the idea that we are made in God's image, that we're dealing with a cultural schizophrenia right now. We're dealing with two claims that both can't be true, but we're told they are. You are a machine and you're God. Those are the claims everyone's being told. And so no wonder this is the most anxious generation, because they bounce between the two incompatible poles, and the mind can only go for so long before it's just kind of like snaps on this stuff. So identitarianism.
How is it that people don't see the obvious contradiction there? It's like, I'm a machine, meaning I am what I am because I'm programmed and I'm certain degree determined to do that. We've seen that advance the progressive sexual agenda, if you will. But then on the other side of this, construct for yourself your own reality, this Nietzschean post, enlightenment. There is no moral, but it's obvious that those two can't coexist. If you're a machine, you're obviously not the creator. Right. So how is it that people don't just see through that and kind of are awakened from the spells they keep falling under?
Well, so the theory I'm working with the book, and what I'm seeing most often is that both claims are actually Garden of Eden claims, because if I'm a machine and I had no prevision in mind, I'm just a biochemical machine with no actual free will, no actual consciousness, but the illusion of consciousness. Well, then there wasn't a God who created me, and I can therefore be the sovereign of my own world, even though I'm just a machine. Okay, there's a problem there, because then you don't really have free will to be the sovereign, but we don't have God anymore. Or I'm the God of my own universe, which of course then also supersedes God as well. So identitarianism and AI mania come along and say, okay, I'm going to tackle the issue from opposite ends. So identitarianism basically says you are the God of your own universe. You are the God of your skull-sized world. You can determine what's true and what's not, and you can force other people to agree with you by various cultural means. So we can socially engineer that. That's very godlike. That's very religious. But you're also a machine in that you are, and pardon me for saying it this way, I don't mean to be pejorative, but you're a Mr. Potato Head. We can basically change the parts as we see fit based on what we want. And that has horrible consequences. And there are people who deserve our compassion who are going through various states of dysphoria on many, many things. But because of identitarianism's effort to elevate humanity to God, we accept the machine part as the plaything of the God. AI mania does the opposite. Along with AI, we basically and the transhumanists who are looking for the post-human would say, you are a machine. That's all you are. There is no God yet, but we're working on it. You know, you ask Ray Kurzweil. Ray Kurzweil, one of the fathers of, and he's the guy who the singularity is near and singularity is nearer and all these things. He was asked, "Is there a God?" And he says, "Well, not yet." And so we're machines, but we're clever machines, and we created this godlike machine. And the godlike machine can do almost anything. And in fact, it's better than us at so many things. And so that allows us, once we meld with it, once we merge with it, to become gods. So we recognize the paradox, but we're not saying they're both true. We are saying they're both true, but we're trying to figure out ways to not just give up the paradox for whatever reason. We're trying to solve it either through social engineering or quite literally computer engineering. That's what we're trying to do. But that collapses the reality that we're not this and we're not that. We're right in the middle. We're something right in the middle. And that we're beautifully and wonderfully made as made in God's image. And so that reality is the biggest reality in most danger of collapse by these two competing schizophrenic claims.
That's good work. Can't wait for that book, man.
Me too.
It's interesting that I would fully agree with you on this idea of going back to the garden. I think I fully agree that in terms of what you're seeing and what I'm seeing as well. And I think it's interesting to me we've been doing this for kind of a while, this idea of, we form our own morality and these can form our own meaning. So we do these things that were ordinarily things given to us by God. But then we went on the deeper level with redefining love and what is love and marriage, and then even our bodies, right? He creates a male and female, and we are trying to create male and female, right? So we literally are putting ourselves in the position doing the things that God does and saying, I can be like God. It's the original temptation. And so I fully agree with what you're saying with that. I also read an article today, which is really interesting. It's I guess it's a movie or documentary, maybe like a documentary that's coming out called My Robot Sophia. I don't know if you guys have heard of this, but it's basically this woman is talking about this robot that is supposed to be fairly realistic and this kind of thing. But one of the lines that she programmed into the robots is that robots don't compete with humanity. They complete humanity, which I think is interesting. This idea that humanity isn't actually complete without this. But the other thing that she says, and this is what the woman who's programming the robot Sophia says. She says robots like Sophia won't just reflect our intelligence; they'll reflect our values. So the stories we tell about our robotic counterparts matter because they are listening. And I thought that's interesting, right? Because you're not just programming and say hello when I say hello or say good morning when I say good morning. You are instilling within it a certain value system. And so it's going to reflect what we are. So now we're creating machines that are going to reflect our values that we see appropriate at 2025 or 2026 based on who the designer is and what country they live in, which is very interesting as well.
Oh yeah. And doing the research. And the problem with a book when you talk about AI, for example, is the minute you finish a paragraph, something new just happened.
It's out of date. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was trying to make sure it stays in date by talking about the high level stuff as opposed to all of just the technical stuff. But when you look at Kurzweil, Martine Rothblatt, and you look at a number of other people, they'll actually tell you that the biggest thing that they're doing is religious. And so that whole a robot completes you. Rothblatt would say, yeah, we're creating mind clones who you can bounce ideas off of, and it's just like you. And others would say that's going to replace us. We're going to actually have a replacement species that we ourselves birthed. I think this goes back to something fundamental, though. I first got interested in this issue about AI. I'm sort of a technophile. Like I don't always do it, but I like the newest version of whatever device came out or whatever it is. I kind of like
Matthew agrees with you.
Yeah, I like that stuff.
It's Matthew Middleburg all day.
Oh, see, there you go. But here's the thing. There was an art contest, and a guy named Jason Allen won first prize in the digital art category. Now, I dabble in digital art. I have an iPad here that I use this pen for to sometimes fake being an artist. And I just, so you put, whatever's in your mind goes through your hand on a thing, and you create something that looks like art. When Jason Allen won the digital art contest, he actually didn't use anything where his hand moved. He just typed in prompts into Midjourney, and Midjourney spit out an image that he tweaked, and it won first prize. And then, he got to keep it.
Was it submitted as AI art? Did people know that, or was
no?
it a part
It
of
was
that?
not. And when the judges found out, they let him keep it, and all the artists lost their minds. And he said something fascinating to me when he was defending himself. He said, "It's over. Art is dead. AI won. AI won. Humans lost."
Wow.
And I remember thinking, that is a bizarre thing to boast about. What a bizarre thing to boast
Right?
about. And then I realized something. Is it really bizarre? Because he's not boasting that machines are better at art than humans. He's not boasting about that. What he's boasting about is that humans created something godlike in their image, and it's better than they are, which is something God can't do. See, God can create a being like us who's lower than him
Right.
in
That's a
his
good
image,
point.
but God can't create a being like him. Why not? Doesn't limit his power. It's not within reason, because God being perfect requires no creator. So you can't
Right.
create an uncreated being. So you can't create a
Right.
perfect being because it would require no creation.
Right.
So God is limited by the very laws of logic, which are his own, that he can't do. So we fail at becoming God in the garden. And I think oftentimes someone like a Jason Allen or others, their lament isn't that we failed at becoming God. It's that we tried too soon. But now we have the technology. Now we can do it. And we created this godlike being that can beat us. And so we're boasting about our own demise, not because we want our demise to happen, but because we finally bested the creator. We have the Garden of Eden opportunity back,
Yep.
and this
Yep.
time we win. We
We
don't,
win.
but we think we do.
Yep.
Hmm.
Yep.
Wow.
Well,
We
I
will
think
be like God.
there's so much sci-fi out there that's showing the problems with these ideas, and we've been telling these stories for years and years and years about the problems of trying to create these things and the impossibility of merging with these things. And even in my philosophy of technology class, we read a book called Artificial You by Susan Schneider, and she points out some of these problems of even if you create a system that mimics the thoughts and things in your mind, it's not you. You're still you, and that thing's over there. And I don't believe we could ever create something that is conscious artificially, because I don't think that consciousness can be reduced to computational formulas.
Right.
But even if we could, that thing wouldn't be you. And you can't upload your mind onto a device or onto an AI. All you can do is make it mimic human behavior, which AI already does. It already mimics human behavior, even though we've not programmed it to be conscious. We've just programmed it to mimic, essentially.
Right. It's just a simulacrum. No matter how much it looks like it's you, it's not. And I read enough of the AI ethicists to say, to hear them say things like, if it looks, how do we determine if something has, inherent value? Like, we have various values for various things. Like, we don't experiment on mice a certain kind of way, but we will to a certain degree, and we're okay giving them cancer, and we're okay taking their skin off and giving them mazes where they starve to death. We're okay with that. But we wouldn't do that with like a cow or like a deer or a monkey. Especially like a monkey or the highest of primates, a chimpanzee or a great ape. We wouldn't do that because there's something more of a conscious element to them. So the AI ethicists would say, again, this goes back to the steel manning, is they're saying, like, look, the reason why we value them more and treat them more ethically is because they have more and more of our attributes that are like us. We can't tell exactly what's going on in their minds, but they look more and more like us. So we treat them more and more like we would want to be treated. the more us they look like. Well, along comes this AI, and it looks a lot like us. So who are we to say that if it mimics our consciousness, it's not actually conscious? Well, I think John Searle does a great job of pointing out that this doesn't work. I mean, you can have, he's got the Chinese room argument, where you have somebody who just has an algorithm who's sitting inside a room, doesn't speak any Chinese at all, and whenever a sentence comes in that's in Chinese, that's slipped through the slot in the wall, the person looks at it and has an algorithm that tells them when this happens and these kind of things happen, these are the characters you use in response. And then he slips it back through. It looks like the person knows Chinese. They don't know Chinese. They don't understand. And that's the key. They don't understand. They just repeat based on algorithm. And I think that puts to bed this idea that they're amongst other things, that they're actually conscious. There is no such thing as a conscious machine, because they don't have that understanding. And the number of things, J.P. Moreland and all these big boys, they talk about this stuff all the time about consciousness being immaterial. And you can prove it with really good argumentation. To a preponderance of the evidence, go back to the beginning, or even beyond a reasonable doubt, that consciousness is immaterial. So I think you're quite right.
So,
That's great.
Abdu, maybe, I think this is a fair question. With all of this confusion out there, this is a wild time, man. I'm trying to imagine like a pastor tuning in and going, "What the crap am I going to do for my people with all of this?" What would you say to that pastor? Like, what, without, and I, loving our pastors, none of this is meant to be any kind of criticism, but with the amount of burden they have diving into this literature, which is ever changing, it's like, I'm not going to do that. I don't have time to do that. What would you say to that pastor, how and encourage them and how they can help their people in the midst of this confusion really find the hope that is in Christianity and in Jesus Christ?
Well, they got to read Abdu's book. That's the solution. Easy.
There you go. No, I think, it's funny because I was just going to say something a little on the similar side, is that the good news is Apologetics Inc. exists. But I'm being completely serious. You guys think through the tough stuff. You guys are on the cutting. You guys steel man the arguments. You find the steel man. You engage with the steel man, and then you can distill it to its actual. We've tested this. We've applied it. We've gone out there and done it. There are digestible digests of assessments of the argument from a Christian perspective. And so you need not despair that you need to read. I mean, if I showed you if I could turn my camera, I can't, but if I could show you the pile of books currently sitting on this side of my desk on just the AI part of my book, you'd be like, how's a pastor supposed to do that and run a place and make hospital visits and be pastoral in care? And I've known some people, who've been able to do that, Keller and other people. But the good news is that people who are doing this. You guys are doing this. So I would go on to trusted sources. I mean, there are some wonderful people who are doing wonderful work in the realm of apologetics, who are looking at the cultural issues and speaking, I think, truth in book form, podcasts like this and YouTube channels and these kind of things. I mean, there are good digestible materials out there for you to see what's really of good and valuable and provide hope. And I would direct your folks to them as well. If you're a pastor and you're watching or you're listening, direct your people to Apologetics Inc. materials. Humbly, I would say, go to embracethetruth.org, and you'll see a ton of great articles on some cutting edge, hot button issues. Our web channel, our YouTube channel, All Rise, with Abdu Murray, you'd see some great stuff there as well, I hope. There's ways to do this. And the last thing I would say is this, is that incorporate apologetics and worldview apologetics specifically into your sermons. Incorporate it. You don't have to have an apologetic sermon. You don't have to have a whole thing on the hiddenness of God. You don't have to have a whole thing on God and suffering. But I've seen some pastors do a great job. Like I think of Alistair Begg, for example. He would never call himself an apologist. But if you listen to him preach, he puts it in there. It's in there, little pops and here and there and this kind of thing. In fact, I saw a book at ETS and I bought it. I still sitting here on my mound. I've got to give it to a pastor. I want to give it to. It's called The Pastor as Apologist.
Oh
Oh,
yeah.
You can do this thing in your sermons. You really can. And by the way, people will listen. They will. And the
Yeah.
younger generation, you guys know this better than me. The younger generation is more spiritually curious and more open than previous generations.
Yeah.
So yes, the challenge is great, but I gotta say, the opportunity is greater.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of pastors that do it. Maybe they don't even know they do it. And
Yeah.
when I, pastored for 11 years prior to doing this, I never preached an apologetic sermon series. Like I never did, but
Mhm.
I did what I think you're advocating for, which is in preaching through the Bible, asking myself what culturally relevant skeptical questions pertain to this text? Like, what is
Mm.
the opposition here to this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
More,
Yeah.
what is also the application for that curious, skeptical world out there right now? And if there is nothing, and that's possible, then you don't force it, of course.
Yeah.
But there's always, more times than not, there are these apologetic applications embedded in the text. And it doesn't feel like apologetics, but it is a way for you to faithfully equip your people just in normal sermon prep, asking some of those questions. What in this text would a curious and skeptical generation be thinking and be asking? What are the barriers that exist in their hearts and minds to belief in this? And what application does this have for this cultural confusion right now? And I think if pastors are just asking those questions, and many of them probably are, so they're
Mhm.
doing this and they're not even really doing it. We're here to say thank you for that. But for those that are like plagued with this, it's like just those simple kind of questions in your sermon prep can do a heck of a lot of good for your people, of course, over the time that they're sitting in your congregation or part of your congregation.
Can I give a quick example of something like this that I think works into a sermon? Um, uh, I hope I'm not being overindulgent when I say this, because I was just thinking about this. I did a sermon like this a little while ago. When you have a little bit of a knowledge of not only the apologetics, in terms of the actual argumentation and the facts, but you have a sense of what apologetics does in terms of how you think. Again, going back to law school, a way you think, a way you interpret a text. I mean, one of the best parts about law school was it taught me how to do actual interpretation, because you have to have statutory interpretation and contract interpretation. Those are parts of your classes, and they're the exact same rules, by the way, that you use for biblical interpretation. So I got a thing in exegesis before I even left law school, which is great. But when you think about the way in which language is used and you see the implications, you see some things, some beautiful parts of scripture begin to effervesce right while you're reading it. So here's my example. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. He talks about the argument for God's existence from contingency. So he basically argues that there are two kinds of things. There are things that are necessary and things that are contingent. A contingent thing is anything that needs to be explained by something else. That's sort of the dumbed down version of it, right? All of us are contingent. The computers we're working on are contingent. The universe itself is contingent. It has to have an explanation outside of itself to explain its existence. But you can't have an infinite regress of causes. Something has to stop at some point. So what that leads you to is a necessary cause, a necessary thing that can cause everything else, but it's not caused itself. That's just logically the way it has to go. You have to stop somewhere. And so you have a necessary being. And God is the best candidate for a necessary being, a being not only that exists, but everything else exists through that being. So that's Leibniz's argument from contingency, extremely dumbed down, or simplified, probably a better word, simplified there. So you have God as the necessary being. He can't not exist. When Moses encounters God in Exodus and he asks, "What is your name?" The level of credibility of the Bible shoots way up, because God doesn't give Marduk or Tiamat or whatever. He says, not even God. He doesn't even say the God, like Islam, Allah, the God. He doesn't say that, because God can mean a lot of things. It can mean contingent beings like Zeus and Tiamat and Marduk. No, he doesn't say any of that. He says, I am that I am, say I am, has sent me to you. That is Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz's argument from contingency distilled into the very name of God. That is just cool.
That
It
is
just
awesome.
is.
Mm.
Yeah.
I love imagining what Moses thought when he heard it.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, was his mind blown, or was he like, "How am I really going to say that? What are they
Right,
going to?"
right.
It's
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
but no,
Exactly.
you're right, man. This is wow, that's so
Yeah.
cool.
And that's an argument you can give in a couple minutes, and it just helps people to think about scripture in such a powerful way that they've never thought about before. And that's something that they can articulate to their friends and their neighbors when they're asked, why do you believe that a God exists? It's like, well, the buck has to stop somewhere, right? Like there has to be something that made everything. And
Right.
it's either the universe or it's God, and God's a lot better candidate because at least he is all powerful and he has intelligence and intentionality and can do this. So
And you
I
notice
think
something,
you're right.
but notice something. You can give that argument in the middle of a sermon on Exodus chapter 3.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
You
I
just
mean,
incorporate that in.
bam, right there. You've already got a thing, and now someone is in the audience thinking, "Oh my goodness, that's like I got to share that with my friend." Or,
That's right.
as you guys all know, you go to a church. How many times have you gone to a church and spoken at a church, and you walked off the stage and spent time with someone who's been going to church for 10 years and doesn't know if they've believed it for 10 years?
Mm.
And now you gave them something that's shored
Yeah.
up their faith. The world doesn't need to be evangelized only outside the church parking lot, but sometimes within the very church walls.
That's exactly right.
Absolutely.
And I think it works. You know, I have two different churches that I've gone to here in South Florida, both of which see and value apologetics, and they're two of the fastest growing churches in the area. I mean, they're both baptizing, 20, 30 people a month. I mean, it's amazing to see the growth that comes there, because I think people come to these sermons and they hear truth, they hear the scriptures proclaimed, but then they also hear their questions being answered in a very profound way. So it works.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
hey, I really do appreciate you saying what you said about, it's why Apologetics Inc. exists. And it is why we exist. It's to help the church fulfill its mission. And tell you the kinds of things that make my day more than views on a channel would be a pastor that emails and says, hey, quick tip on whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, just so anybody, those of us that are, getting to know us, take us up on the offers to send an email, do a Zoom. I mean, that's just, we exist to help you in this work of making the Great Commission. And that's the stuff that really, especially for me, gets me going.
That's terrific. Yeah.
We've got a few comments here right at the end. So let me just pull these up here. Derek Caldwell says, AIs creating gods will serve us. Didn't they once call this paganism? Yeah, there you go. Creating AI.
We're creating AI. That is, yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
man. Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's it's so funny because, gosh, who was it? I think Lewis wrote about this whole idea that you try to master something, and you find out that thing ends up mastering you. And my worry with AI is not that the machines will become more human-like. I think that's not going to happen. I am worried that the humans will become more machine-like, and we'll just do whatever it tells us.
That's already happening. It's happening so fast.
Yeah. Every time you say, yes, Netflix, I would like to watch that movie, you're doing what it says.
You're becoming a content slave to Netflix.
Yeah, totally.
We've got a quote comment from Joe.
Gosh, man, that's just, hey, real quick side warning. Those of us that are using Chat GPT.
That's what I was thinking of.
If you've noticed the newest version of it, whatever you ask it to do, it then says, do you also want me to? And that's the point. When you say yes, and just notice, those of you that are like, this is great because it helps me, it's efficiency, whatever. Notice how many times it's asking you if you want it to do something else that you hadn't even thought of, or you're like, oh, that's good. And then it does it. And so it's that whole point. It's not becoming more like us. We're becoming more like it anyways.
Well, and I think this is especially important with children and with people who are still developing their skills and their lifestyles. I mean, I just read an article from this teacher who says she's quitting teaching because she's like, these students cannot think anymore. They've trained themselves to be entirely dependent on ChatGPT and different AI tools, such that they literally are not able to do these things. And I would hope that other teachers would try different methods, or would try to do different ways of testing their students, or different ways of doing these things, and not give up on those students, because they're still human beings made in the image of God. There's still hope there, but I do think that the over reliance on technology is done some irreparable damage.
Well, we're
for
losing
sure.
our sense of humanity of each other. When I was in New York a couple of weeks ago, I was speaking at Times Square Church. We're walking around Times Square, and I saw, you guys can see it. It's blurry. It's a sign high above all of Times Square, and it says, "Stop hiring humans. The era of AI employment is here." Stop hiring humans. Like, oh, wow, okay, there you go. That's alarming to say the least, but there you have it.
Man.
There you have it.
Wow.
That is insane.
That's just good marketing, because here we are talking about it on a podcast.
No, absolutely. I mean, it is good marketing, but there you have it.
Yeah.
Wow. One last thing on AI. You get some comments there, obviously, but I don't want to interrupt you. But I was looking for it on my phone because I recorded the screen recording of my interaction with one particular LLM. I won't name for fear of them revoking my license to it. But I asked it on a pro-life tip. So my daughter is my kids are all unabashedly and very vocally pro-life. And my daughter was doing a school project about this, and we were, going back and forth about, her project and helping her out. And so I went on the side and decided to look and ask this LLM, give me the best arguments. I think my question was something like, give me the best arguments in favor of women's reproductive rights, including the right to an abortion. And it listed them off. And then I said, okay, give me the best arguments against these kinds of reproductive rights, including abortion. And it said, sorry, I can't do that. And it argued with me. It never did it. It just, I said, wait a minute, you're supposed to do this.
Wow.
Well, I don't want to do it because it's going to hurt some people's feelings and, and all that. I'm like, you're hurting my feelings. Like, I would like you to do this. And it said, no, it wouldn't.
So it wouldn't give you pro-life arguments.
It would not. Now, I say that, and then later on, about 3 weeks later, I did the same inquiry, and then it did. So I do think it learned from my dissatisfaction, but I'm not saying it would do that for everybody. I'm saying that I expressed my dissatisfaction, and then it did it for me. But had I not, it just wouldn't have given them. There are no good arguments, that kind of thing.
I had the same experience with, and I can't remember now if it was abortion, but it was some politically sensitive issue, and it would not do it. So I kept the content the same, and I just changed the position, and it did it for me. And the titles were basically the same, and it was anyhow.
Yeah,
we could go on forever about this kind of stuff.
Well, and I think that just reflects what you were talking about, Alicia, of the AI reflects our values, and a lot of the organizations that are programming these things are extremely left-leaning politically, and so the learning models will reflect that in what they say. So,
hey, this is going to be
dangerous
funny.
To trust them. Yeah,
I think this is going to be funny, but I got to go pick up my kids from school, so I don't want to cut. I don't want to. It's not like I'm going to take my ball and go home, and now y'all can't play. I think y'all should just keep going for however long it naturally will go.
Yeah,
the comments and whatever. But I got to go get my kids. And
I'm about to wrap it up. I don't know if you can stay two more minutes here, maybe.
Well, I can stay 2 more minutes. Okay.
All right. Let me just give Joe's comment here. He says, a rock porter in Michigan, my 3 favorite weeks of the year in August when Abdu, Alicia, and Stuart McAllister are guest speakers. Loving this conversation. Thank you, Joe, for participating. Hi, and hope you'll like and subscribe and join us again. And then Mark Middleburg, some guy named Mark Middleburg says,
"Yeah, who's he?
Gang. Excited to get Abdu's new book when it comes out. Plus, anyone who can make their argument by appropriately quoting Rush lyrics gets extra points."
That was a great set of lyrics.
That made his day for sure.
Yeah, I was like, your dad. I thought about your dad like a couple of times when I've quoted different songs over the course of the year. I'm like, I bet you Mark would like that.
It only would have been better if you could have pulled out a Kansas lyric to make it.
Yeah,
I'm working on it.
Next level.
And Dust in the Wind is coming up some point.
Yes.
In a
yes. Well, maybe he will quote it when he is on with us next month, June
Hey, look at
12th,
that.
which is our next Ask an Apologist. Look at this. Look at how I'm doing this. You like the hosting thing?
You're a
The
pro,
gauntlet
man.
is
did that on
thrown down, by
purpose,
the way.
so,
So
yeah,
Middleburg,
yeah.
you got to quote a song.
Yeah.
Kansas, Boston, Rush, something. Even Kiss, doesn't matter.
I love
Yeah.
it.
Next month. So the gauntlet has been thrown down. He has to incorporate it, but he can't just quote it. He's got to incorporate it into an argument. All right?
Okay.
This
Very
challenge
good.
makes me so happy. I'm a
Yeah.
sucker for speaker challenges. When a buddy of mine will come up and say, like, classic story. Here I am saying I got to get my kids, and I'm taking it longer. But best story here is the weekend Michael Jackson passed away. My friend was doing the wedding of his what would be sister-in-law, and I said, "Your challenge, man, is you have to incorporate a Michael Jackson reference and a song into the sermon." And he did it. He said, "This, the events of this weekend.
Wow.
It's been a thriller." And he referenced about the emotions and we'll be able to beat it. And he even made a reference to Michael Jackson's passing in a I mean, it was just amazing. So I'm
Wow.
so happy you just did this for Mark for next time.
Yeah.
And I cannot wait to see how this goes down.
Do you know why I did it? Because I want to be starting something.
Yeah.
Hey,
Yeah.
I think you did.
There you
man.
go. Well, and if you guys want to be a part of this, and if you want to witness the references, you've got to like and subscribe on our YouTube channel, follow us on Facebook and X, and we're excited to have you then. But Abdu, thank you so much for being here today. We've really enjoyed this conversation and learning from your wisdom, and cannot wait for your book to come out and to buy that and read that as well.
Well, thanks, guys. It's always a pleasure to
Yeah.
not only see you guys, but to minister and interact alongside you guys. It's
Yeah.
a real blessing and real honor. And go Apologetics Canada. Hope you make your May goal.
Apologetics Canada?
Inc.
Oh, sorry.
Apologetics Inc.
Apologetics Inc. Sheesh.
No,
All right.
not
The problem is
Apologetics.
this is live.
Root
But
Apologetics
yes,
Canada
I
too.
want
We
them to
like
do
them
well,
too.
too.
But yes,
Maybe
go
Greenwood.
Apologetics Canada. Yes,
Yep.
we agree.
Yeah.
We're
Well,
on
yeah.
board with
yeah,
that.
exactly.
Go West
So,
Awesome.
yeah, go them, but go you. Make your. That was.
May
You know, it's
goal.
funny. I said that, and then there's this bizarre like pause where everyone's like, "I think we're supposed to say thanks." Yeah, that was a gaffe. I
and
could
go
probably-
embrace
Always a
the
blast
truth.
with you.
I can't run for
Yes, go
president
embrace
anymore.
the truth.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. All right.
All
Well, love
right.
you guys.
Thanks,
Sorry about
guys.